Benjamin Franklin once wrote, "In this world, nothing can be said to be certain except death and taxes." And will the Messiah have leprosy? We'll take a quick look at how different levels of interpretation of the Torah work. This is Rabbi Yossi Madvig, and you're listening to Jews Did It First. Hey everyone, thanks so much for tuning in. Please, again, whatever you're listening on, whether it's iTunes or Stitcher, YouTube, whatever it is, subscribe, turn on the notifications, leave a review, write a comment below, whatever it is. And if you'd like to donate to help contribute to the podcast, please go to jewishoswego.org/Jews Did It First. Click on that Make a Donation button in the upper right-hand corner. Really appreciate the help. So, taxes. Well, since taxes were due this week, unless you filed an extension like I did, I thought I'd do this week's show about taxes. Well, I guess more so tithing, but we'll get into that in a second. So actually, taxes themselves are not something that Jews did first. From the first institution of government, there's been some sort of implementation of collecting money from the citizens for public welfare. And it goes to things like whatever, roads, military, of course, to fill the king's coffers, I'm sure. The first recorded taxation system in the archaeological record seems to be from ancient Egypt, about 5,000 years ago or so, in the first dynasty of Egypt, which is the Old Kingdom of Egypt, whatever that is, but that's what I had found in my research there. So about the year 3000 to 2800 BCE. And the earliest and most widespread form of taxation was something called the corvée. Now, the corvée was basically forced labor, and that was done by the state for peasants who were too poor to pay any other kind of taxation. In fact, I guess the word labor in ancient Egyptian is a synonym for taxes. And records show that the pharaoh would conduct a tour of the kingdom every other year, and he would collect taxes from the people. Funny enough, some Egyptian taxation is mentioned in the Bible. In Genesis chapter 47 and verse 24, it says that when the crop comes in, a fifth shall be given to the pharaoh. The other 4/5 you can keep as seed for the fields and as food for yourselves and your households and your children. So Joseph was telling the people of Egypt how to divide their crop, providing a portion, a tax to Pharaoh, and that tax being a share, a 20% share of the crop. Also moving along in history, the Persian Empire also had a very intricate tax system, which was dependent on where you were in your satrap, which was a kind of province at their particular governor. And at different times, there were anywhere between 20 and 30 of these satraps in the empire, and each one was assessed according to its productivity, its specialty. So you had people go around every year collecting what it was that was owed and deducting the expenses, and that was sent to the treasury. And each one was different. It was pretty interesting. For instance, Babylon was assessed for the highest amount, and it had quite a different amount of commodities over there. They had to do about 1,000 silver talents and 4 months' supply of food for the army. India, which was known for its gold, that had to supply a lot of gold dust, equal to about, I think almost 4,700 silver talents. And Egypt, which was known for a lot of its crops, it was sort of the granary of the Persian Empire, and it had to give a lot, like 120,000 measures of grain, also a bunch of silver. And this was done depending on each satrap according to what it could give. So that's sort of a brief ancient historical rundown of taxation. And of course, the ancient Israelites had taxes also. In fact, it was a big scandal in the days of King Solomon, and especially his son Rehoboam, when very high taxes were implemented for a palace and other projects. But there's a certain type of tax that's gone around, especially in current political discourse, and that is the flat tax. And that's where everyone pays a certain percentage, whether it's 10% or 15% or 20%, whatever it is, instead of what we have, which is called a progressive tax, where the percentage you pay goes up depending on your income. And an example of a country that uses a flat tax would be Russia, for instance. In fact, in the last presidential debate, the candidates, I think it was Ben Carson, pushed for something like this. Ted Cruz had mentioned something like this, as well as I think Herman Cain in the election beforehand. I think that was in 2008. And basically, their main reasoning behind it often was they liked the biblical system of tithing, and they based their plans off of that primarily. So therefore, I thought it would be a good thing to go through the biblical system of tithing, because although many equate tithing with churches, it's important to note that Jews did it first. Like I said, everyone knows about tithing to a church. The Mormons are supposedly really big on tithing, but where do they get it from? Yes, it is a biblical concept, but not the Christian Bible, the Jewish one. Tithing is actually a very involved process, more so than people realize. It's actually a 7-year process. Well, 6 years, but there's a 7th year, which we'll get to. And there's several different types of tithes. Lumped together with tithing, although it's not an actual tithe, is something called teruma. So teruma, which is the modern Hebrew word for donation, but biblically, it's the first portion of your crops or whatever it is that are given to the Kohen, the priest who serves in the temple in Jerusalem. This doesn't necessarily have a set value, but it was rabbinically structured to be either 1/40th, if you're generous, 1/60th, if you're kind of stingy, and the middle ground is 1/50th, or 2%, and that was sort of the accepted custom to do. After that, you have the actual tithe, or maaser in Hebrew, and the word maaser is just like the word tithe in English, right? So tithe comes from a tenth, maaser comes from the word eser, which means 10. So how would this work? Let's say I had 100 pounds of flour. So first I give that small amount, that 2% of truma, to the Kohen, the priest, which leaves me with now 98 pounds of flour. So I then tithe that remaining flour, which would be 9.8 pounds, and that's called Maaser Rishon, which means the first tithe, because it's the first time I'm tithing. And that's given to the Levites, who also work in the temple. Now the Levite himself, by the way, then tithes what he gets and gives it to the Kohen. So that would be almost a pound, right? 0.98 in this example. And he gives that to the Kohen. And that's what's mentioned in Bamidbar, or in Numbers, chapter 18, verse 26. So now I've got left 88.2 pounds of flour in this example. So I have to tithe once more, which would be about 8.8 pounds of flour. And this second tithe is called, naturally, the second tithe, or Maaser Sheni in Hebrew. Usually, you're supposed to take that tithe to Jerusalem and eat it. However, in Deuteronomy chapter 14, verse 28, it says that every 3 years, it belongs in my local cities, meaning you don't take it to Jerusalem. And if you read the next verse, it continues saying that it's for the foreigner, the orphan, and the widow, meaning the poor, right? So some years I take my Maaser Sheni, my second tithe, to Jerusalem and eat it, and some years I keep it and give it to the poor. I don't take it to Jerusalem. So within this 7-year cycle, the Maaser Sheni that I give to that I take to Jerusalem, that's required in the first year and the second year, and the fourth year as well as the fifth year. Now, the third year and the sixth year, that's when it's designated for the poor, and it's actually then called with a different name, Maser Ani. It's a tithe for the poor, but it's really the same thing. It's that Maaser Sheni. And then the seventh year, the sabbatical year, there are actually no tithes taken at all. So, and the seventh year is, again, that's the sabbatical. That's something else Jews did first. I'll talk about that more at length on another episode, maybe next week or something like that. And lest you think that that's all that's given to the poor is just the third and the sixth year, there are actually 3 other mandatory gifts that apply all the time whenever there's a harvest that are specifically for the poor. And those are leaving a corner of your field. Also, any plants that you kind of forget, as well as bundles or sheaves that you drop accidentally. All of that has to be left for the poor. And that's all in addition, of course, to what you give out of the generosity of your own heart. But back to the tithes. So why is Truma and Maaser given to the Kohanim and the Levites? Well, they are actually not given a portion in the land of Israel like the other tribes. So it said, God tells them, God is your portion. And so they are sort of living off the generosity of the rest of the Jewish people and also their productivity. So God says, you, the Levites, which includes the Kohanim and the priests, you have to stay in some certain designated cities. And your job is to serve me. Your job is to serve in the temple and make sure that everything is going well in the spiritual arena. And you do not get a physical portion of land in the land of Israel. And I, God, am your portion. And so therefore their physical needs are taken care of by the rest of the Jewish people. So that's where the idea of tithing originates. That's how it works. And as we can see, of course, Jews did it first. In this week's Dvar Torah, or Torah Thought, I wanted to just briefly take you on a small journey on how different levels of interpreting the Torah work. You may not be familiar, but there's actually 4 different ways that the Torah is interpreted. One is the Peshat, the simple meaning of the text. Then you have the Remez, what the text might be hinting at. And then you have the Drush, or the sort of homiletical portion, the homiletical interpretation, as well as the Sod, or the hidden mystical explanation of the text. And then finally, not so much a 5th level, but something that really gives life to the rest of the other interpretations and makes it, more geschmack, as we say in Yiddish. And that would be Hasidus, or Hasidic philosophy. So we're dealing with the portion of the Torah right now, which can be kind of dry for some people. It's dealing with the laws of what's called tsarat, or tsaras, which is often translated as leprosy, but that's a really poor translation. It was basically a affliction that was put on either on the skin, or on clothing, or on buildings, and it was primarily for the sin of Lashon Hara, of speaking badly about another person. There were other sins that it was given for as well, but that's what we're going to focus on now. And so there's a verse in Leviticus 14, verse 2. It says like this: "This shall be the law of the tsarat, person afflicted with tsarat. On the day of his cleansing, he shall be brought to the Kohen." So an example of the Peshat, the simple explanation. Rashi, one of the main commentators, he quotes the words that this is the law of the person afflicted with tsarat on the day. And he says this teaches us that one afflicted with tsarat is not pronounced clean at night, only on the day, right? The day of his cleansing. So this is just a very simple, straightforward way of understanding the verse. An example of the remez, the hint, and a good example would be from the Baal HaTurim, who's also a very famous commentator, and he says that the verse says, "This shall be the law," in Hebrew, the Torah. This is the Torah of the tsarat person. And he says the term Torah appears 5 times in these portions concerning tsarat. And the 5 times correspond to the 5 books of the Torah, right? You have Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. So, a person who speaks lashon hara, evil talk, or slander, is considered as if he has transgressed all the 5 books of the Torah. That's what it's hinting at there, saying Torah 5 times. There's also 10 passages, he says, that speak of tzarat afflictions, including body, garments, and houses, and this implies that if one keeps the 10 commandments, he will be saved from these 10 afflictions. Now, you also have the drush, the homiletical. What is it teaching us? It says, this shall be, right? This shall be the law of the tzarat person. So the Or HaChaim, another famous commentator, he explains that these unnecessary words, doesn't have to say this shall be the law of the Torah. You could just say the law of the tzarat person. So the unnecessary words, this shall be, show that the metzora, the person who was afflicted, has been guilty of slander. Why did the Torah allude to this here just with the afflicted person? Just when the afflicted person undergoes the rites of purification. His first offerings are birds because they remind the person of his loose tongue, just like a bird twitters, right? So too you have the sin of lashon hara, of evil speech. These words hint to the reason why the first offerings in the rehabilitation process are birds. I think I got that a little mixed up. It seems more like I apologize. That was more the hint, and then the Baal HaTurim seems to be more the drush, right? The 5 books of Torah, and you keep the 10 commandments, and so on. I apologize. So then you have the sod, the mystical interpretation of the Torah. And there it explains that tzarat is a departure of the light of Chachma, right? God's capacity of wisdom that he puts into creation. You have this wisdom, the light of wisdom that departs from the world, and the rectification comes through reintroducing that light into the vessels, into the structure of the universe with the Kohen's supervision, because the Kohen spiritually provides light and blessing. So this is a very mystical, esoteric understanding of what's going on over here. And then finally, I want to introduce a Hasidic thought given by the Rebbe, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, where he discusses the concept of tzarat and Mashiach. Mashiach was a famous topic, a very loved topic by the Rebbe, something that motivates a lot of people, right? The coming of Mashiach, of the Messiah. And he says like this: the Talmud in Sanhedrin 98b describes the Mashiach as he exists during exile, meaning before he's revealed himself. It says that every generation has a Mashiach, and before he reveals himself, he's living in exile with the people. And it describes him as someone who has tzarat, as someone who has this affliction. Because Mashiach is a totally pure and holy person. And therefore, he's very spiritually sensitive. And he then bears that suffering of the Jews in exile. The ritual purification of tzarat is through, as we learned earlier, right, in the Baal HaTurim, he says the 10 commandments. So how do you cure this? Through the laws of the Torah. So therefore, one of the ways to speed up Mashiach's coming is to study the concept of Mashiach in the Torah. So here we see Hasidic philosophy really bringing it to life, giving us a practical thing, not just that we could do in our daily lives that makes God happy, but something that really makes a big impact on the world at large. The coming of Mashiach and an ushering in of a totally utopian era, all learned out through this concept of a sometimes boring subject, that of tzarat, of leprosy. Thanks so much for listening. I'd love to stay in touch, so please feel free to continue the conversation on the Facebook page, Jews Did It First. You can email me at rabbi@jewishoswego.org, I'm also on Twitter at Oswego Rabbi. Thanks so much, and Shabbat Shalom.